Cold mornings, frosty windows. Yup, it's that time of year. So treat yourself and start your day with a cup of fresh roasted Sterling Roastery coffee, sourced from around the world and roasted multiple times a week for unbeatable freshness. It's the kind of warm-up every sports fan deserves this holiday season. And right now, you can win one of 3 $50 Sterling gift cards, perfect for gifting or building your own winning lineup of Java in the morning. Enter today at sportshistorynetwork.com/giveaways so you can wake up, warm up, and Sterling up this holiday season. Again, that's sportshistorynetwork.com/giveaways.
125 defining moments, one legendary league. This is Darren Hayes of the Pigskin Dispatch podcast, and a great book is out right now, NFL Moments, 125 icons and stories that define the NFL. It's a definitive visual history of the National Football League, packed with iconic images and untold stories behind the game's biggest plays and its greatest players. From the early legends like Red Grange to today's stars like Patrick Mahomes, this book is a touchdown for fans who crave more than just stories. So give your football bookshelf a Hall of Fame upgrade or snag a holiday gift for that NFL history buff on your shopping list. Pick up NFL Moments, available now at your favorite bookseller.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
As you said, the Southern University Grambling State rivalry for the better part of almost a century now was the number one in-state rivalry in Louisiana.
Absolutely. I mean, when they started playing, back when Grambling was still Louisiana Negro Normal and Industrial Institute, the Tulane LSU rivalry actually did matter. Tulane was good. They were coming off the Rose Bowl. They actually mattered. But that did not last much longer. Pretty soon after that, they leave the SEC. They become just more of an academic focus. And Grambling and Southern pick up the slack. They become the big rivalry. And I can tell you, as somebody who lived in a lower middle class white neighborhood, we all cared too. I mean, we very much saw Grambling as kind of defending us against the South part of the state. And right. I mean, we still saw that and we still followed it very closely. I mean, that still mattered to us.
Sports from back in the day. From Atlanta, it's Dana on the mic, talking old school legends, bringing history to life. We go deep like a spiral in the Superdome, back when athletes left the game due to talking alone. Jordan fadeaways, Jackie in the zone, Ollie in the ring, man, he stood all alone. From the Negro Leagues to the ABA, we break it all down, yeah, the classic way. It's Charles from the district, straight out the boot. Southern University pride, rapping truth in the booth. From Baton Rouge to the nation's capital, legends on deck. Yeah, we factual, tales of the greats, gold chains and all. Baseball, who dreams in that football brawl? No clickbait, no fluff, just the facts we say. It's historically speaking, sports strong back in the game. Play. So sit back, tune in, and hit replay. It's historically speaking sports, the classic way.
There are certain college football rivalries that resonate around the country. Michigan, Ohio State, Alabama, Auburn, Notre Dame, USC, just to name a few. However, there's another football rivalry based in Louisiana that over the years has become more than just a battle for bragging rights between two institutions. It has become the cornerstone event for both a city and a culture. I'm Dana Augusta, the co-host of the Historically Speaking Sports Podcast, the podcast that gives you the best of sports from back in the day. In this all-new edition of the podcast, we will talk with author Tom Aiello and his book, The History of the Bayou Classic. The annual game between the Grambling State Tigers and the Southern University Jaguars evokes memories of great coaching matchups which featured the great Eddie Robinson and incomparable players on both sides, with a number of them reaching the Pro Football Hall of Fame. Now, even though the game known as the Bayou Classic has been around since 1974, the rivalry between Southern and Grambling actually goes back nearly a century, with a very interesting history and backstory. Along with the game, there are a number of other events connected with the Classic that includes the Greek Show, Job Fair, and the famous Battle of the Bands. Yet, of course, what makes the game are its players. And some of the greatest players in NFL history have played in this game. In our shout-out segment, we will highlight some of those players that have starred in this annual game that has become the biggest and most important rivalry in the state of Louisiana. We have all that going on and more in this all-new edition of the Historically Speaking Sports Podcast here on the Sports History Network.
Hey there. Welcome to Music Meets Sports, where sports legends meet custom soundtracks. Founded by music producer Ronald Tyke Oliver, Music Meets Sports was created to bridge generations, educate fans, and celebrate the greatness of both current and former athletes. We craft original songs about heroes in basketball, football, baseball, boxing, and beyond, highlighting their struggles and victories. Across all musical genres, we reintroduce fans to their favorite athletes in a way they've never heard before. From Babe Ruth to Reggie White, from rising WNBA stars to timeless NFL great stream, or download our music now on Apple Music, Amazon, and Spotify. Visit musicmeetsports.org to explore the catalog, hear new releases, and join the movement that's preserving sports history, one song at a time.
And ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to this all-new edition of the Historically Speaking Sports Podcast. I am your pilot tonight, Dana Augusta, and joined as always is my co-pilot, Charles Combs, as we're going to bring you the best of sports from back in the day. And on this particular episode, we have a special guest joining us, Tom Aiello. He was an author, and he's going to be talking to us tonight about the history of the Bayou Classic. He is currently a professor of history at Valdosta State University of Africana Studies, and he's also, like I said, a prolific author. Some of the books he's written so far: Dixie Ball, Race, and Professional Basketball in the Deep South. Also, New Orleans Sports, Playing Hard in the Big Easy. And we're also going to be talking about another book that he wrote later on in the program, so stay tuned for that. But the subject at hand, the lecture of since he is indeed a professor, is going to be about the Bayou Classic tonight. And before we get involved in that, Chuck, glad to have you aboard with us once again.
Always great to be a part of things. Looking forward to this subject, talking about a subject that we grew up in, was a part of, and very dear to us. And Tom, thank you so much for taking time from your schedule to join us today and kind of enlighten us today.
Of course.
Yeah, Tom, thank you for joining us once again. And Tom, tell us a little bit about yourself and tell us about what you did. Well, what do you do, as far as like your profession and everything? Just give us a little brief introduction of yourself to all of our listeners.
Sure. Well, as you mentioned, I teach history and Africana Studies at Valdosta State in South Georgia. I write about a lot of different things, and I kind of go all over the map, but my favorite thing to write about is sports, and everything that I write about has something to do with race in the South. And so the Bayou Classic is obviously very important in all of those regards. And as somebody who is, though I live in Georgia and have for the last 16 years, as somebody who is from Louisiana, it has always kind of held a pride of place in my sports life.
And you said we were talking beforehand that you're from Monroe, Louisiana, up around the northern northern part of Louisiana. I, of course, is from South Louisiana, and Charles is from Baton Rouge, which is totally like a separate own little entity, if you sort of
Right.
speak, And then you wrote about the Bayou Classic. Tell us about when you first heard about the Bayou Classic, or what was your initial thoughts of it before even writing this book?
Well, it's interesting. I came to the Bayou Classic. I was born in the late 70s, and so I grew up in Northeast Louisiana during Eddie Robinson's heyday. So when I was growing up, Grambling was still playing, annual games at Yankee Stadium, and they were winning everything, and it was something that I always filtered through that lens. I didn't give it a lot more thought. We, for example, never went down to watch the Bayou Classic. You can probably know. I mean, you guys know from being from South Louisiana, North Louisiana is a totally different world. I mean, it's essentially just West Mississippi. And
Yeah.
so growing up in a white household in Northeast Louisiana, you can imagine I was never allowed to go down to the Bayou Classic to actually watch when I was a kid. That didn't happen until much later, until I was older. But we always followed it. I come from a very sports heavy family, and we watched every year. It was the biggest game in Louisiana. It still is the most important football game in Louisiana because LSU, the predominantly white school at the time, doesn't have a rival in state the way
Right.
that, say, for example, Mississippi and Mississippi State have, or Georgia and Georgia Tech, um, or Alabama and Auburn. Louisiana doesn't have that with their quote unquote white school, especially prior to the desegregation of athletic programs. And so Grambling and Southern was it. It was the big kind of contest. And it wasn't until much later that I learned the the slander about Grambling being the farm school, the rural, and all the chants that Southern likes to throw at Grambling for being the backwoods rural school up north. That all came to me later. At the time, it was just I am a sports obsessed kid, and I live 20 minutes from Eddie Robinson, the greatest coach in the history of football. And so it became an obsession for me at a young age. And so when I got the skills to be able to kind of, I guess, trace what happened there and why it exists and why it was so important to everyone around me, um, I took that chance.
All right, that's a very very interesting take right there. You said that you went to a Bayou Classic much later on.
Right.
When you went there, did that inspire you to write the book, or did that happen a little later on after that?
Uh, Well, it didn't inspire me to write the book. But I did go as I finished writing. I did go at the one right after I finished the book,
Hmm.
specifically so that I could write about it. The last chapter of that book is about the 2009 Bayou Classic, the 2010 Bayou Classic, and my experience of it, and just being there in the experience. The first Bayou Classic I went to was a few years before that. And at that point, I really wasn't in the headspace to be able to write something like that and to do the kind of hardcore research that it takes to be able to tell that story with the right kind of voice and the right kind of research to do it justice.
Okay, Chuck, you got anything before we move on?
Sure. So you mentioned that you went like a few years prior. So that was post Katrina, and I know we may cover this a little later on, but I noticed like after Katrina, it was a real big fall off in terms of the electricity and the attendance of the Bayou Classic for a few years after Katrina. So in the context of that, was the experience everything that you always thought it would be or envision it would be, growing up as a kid? Did it meet your expectations or exactly how did that go?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, for sports people, it's the game, and it's the fans who are there, and the passion that they have that matters most. And so, yes, absolutely. And by the time that I went to the game in 2010, it was back to being sold out. I mean, it was back to basically what it had been. And so you kind of see both sides of that in the aftermath. And I should say too, it was just different in 2010 because by that point the Superdome had been remodeled and there are less seats for fans and more luxury boxes for rich people. And I mean, one of the draws of the Bayou Classic was always that it was kind of the people's game. And, it was interesting to go back after the remodel and see all the luxury boxes filled, which doesn't really seem in step with the original ethos of the Bayou Classic. But of course, you gotta make that money where you can. Um, no, absolutely. There was a difference, but the game itself and the passion of those who actually do make it into the stadium, none of that was affected by the storm, and I don't think could be really.
Okay.
And as far as like my take from it, I started going to the Bayou Classic relatively early in life, because, in full disclosure, my dad went to Southern, my uncle played for Southern in the 60s. And then I pretty much continued the chain as far as us going. And I could tell you in my neighborhood, you had you had Grambling fans living right next door to me. You had Southern fans a couple houses down from me. Right across the street and over a couple, there was a family of Grambling. So in my neighborhood, which was a predominantly middle class black neighborhood, in South Louisiana, the Bayou Classic was essentially the game of the year. A lot of people call it the Black Super Bowl.
Right.
And for a kid growing up in the 1980s, Chuck, you know this as well as I, during that time, the Bayou Classic was it. Before it started coming on TV nationally, it did come on TV in Louisiana, in South Louisiana, for a
Mhm.
couple times in the early 80s. And it was like appointment television, especially for the black community during that time. And it was essentially the game of the year. You had talked about there was no major in-state rivalry in Louisiana. But Southern and Grambling has taken that over. I mean,
Right.
people say, well, there may be a rivalry between LSU and Tulane, which is the same type of rivalry as a hammer to a nail, So it's
Right.
not necessarily a great rivalry, but as you said, the Southern University Grambling State rivalry for the better part of almost a century now, it was the number one in-state rivalry in Louisiana.
Absolutely. I mean, when they started playing back when Grambling was still Louisiana Negro Normal and Industrial Institute, the Tulane LSU rivalry actually did matter. Tulane was good. They were coming off the Rose Bowl. They actually mattered, but that did not last much longer. Pretty soon after that, they leave the SEC. They become just more of an academic focus, and Grambling and Southern pick up the slack. They become the big rivalry. And I can tell you, as somebody who lived in a lower middle class white neighborhood, um, we all cared too. We very much saw Grambling as kind of defending us against the South part of the state. And
Right.
I mean, we still saw that and we still followed it very closely. I mean, that still mattered to us. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, it is still the biggest sporting event in Louisiana every year.
Okay. Before that, we
Well,
talked before
well,
you
it was
go ahead. Go
it,
ahead, Chuck. Go ahead, Chuck.
so I was just gonna say, like, I had a similar experience to both of you, because like like you, Dana, I grew up in the '80s as well. We were both kids in the '80s, and it was like at the time, like Grambling, even though it's kind of weird dynamic that, like a lot of my church members were Grambling alums, like on the deacon board at my dad's church. And then on my mom's side of the family, most of us, like from Baton Rouge, are Southern alums. And then most of our family from St. Helena Parish and Tangible Whole are for some reason Grambling alums. So it would be like cutthroat at Fourth of July, Thanksgiving, things like that. But it's kind of like a communal vibe also because it was like, unlike most rivalries, you wanted them to do well. Just, we didn't mind Grambling going undefeated. We just wanted to be the ones to knock them off because, what's the what's the point in the celebration of knocking off Grambling if they're no good? And I'm assuming a lot of times they had similar sentiments towards us. So
Right.
it was just a great time. And and in the '80s, that was the Marino Chasm days where we were just getting whooped every year pretty much. So it was just, it
Well,
was tough, but it was just always something we look forward to too.
it was Coach Chasm who said, I mean, that it was the friendliest rivalry in college football because there really was this kind of intense rivalry, but at the same time, nobody hated each other. Everybody understood that in a state with the racial history of Louisiana, we all need to be together on this. And so it was, I want to destroy you for this 3 hours, but then we're all going to go out to eat after it's over. And that mattered.
Yeah.
It mattered both at the game, but it also mattered in those households it meant so much to who were just watching on TV.
Yeah. I hear it all the time as far as my dad and my uncles that attended Southern was that it didn't matter if Southern made more so like this year, if Southern
Mhm.
had a losing season or had like a winless season and they beat Grambling in the Bayou Classic, to us it was a winning season because
That's right.
we
That's a successful season.
that's
Absolutely.
that was a winning season for us. And I remember in doing my research, I remember watching this interview with Doug Williams, and he said basically that this was like a family reunion. It's more of a rivalry, less than a
Right.
rivalry, but more of a family reunion. And I could remember like the weekends before going to church and you could tell who were the Grambling fans and who were the Southern fans because one side of the church was Grambling, the other side of the church was Southern fans. And it was like that for the whole week. Speaking of myself personally, my godfather, who played for Grambling during the late 60s and early 70s, he would he and I would talk maybe once a week until the week of Thanksgiving, and then all bets were off.
Right.
We wouldn't really
Right.
all bets were off. We wouldn't really speak to each other or talk to each other, but we would send we would send text messages to each other, trash talking the other school,
Of
you
course.
know, and that's the way it was for our relationship. And then once the game was over, we'd talk smack during the game, and then after the game was all over, we'd dap each other up and everything else. But the Southern Grambling rivalry, the Bayou Classic, is more than just the game itself. We'll get into a little bit later, but it's a cultural event in Black life, in Black, in all, not only in just Louisiana, but throughout the country. It is a cultural happening, pretty much.
Absolutely. And they call it that. They mean that when they first decided in 74 to go to bring it to New Orleans instead of doing home and homes like they always did before, they said it's going to be a happening. And so they had a beauty pageant and they had a parade and they had all the other stuff that went along with it. And it started to bring in millions upon millions of dollars to New Orleans because it was more than just a football game. It was a week of events. They had a job fair. They had everything. I mean, they made it into an event that paid back a lot of those people who had been supporting the schools all those years.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now, looking back and just gives you a little brief synopsis of the history, and either one of you guys could fill in whenever you get a chance. Grambling and Southern started playing in the 1930s each other like in home and home regular series during the 1930s, heading into the 19 late 60s, early 70s. Okay, there was a home and home series like normal every like regular colleges do. They decided to have it, like you said, Tom, in New Orleans as a central hub of the game starting in 1974. The first game was at Old Tulane Stadium, which was one of the final games ever to be played at Old Tulane Stadium. They would
Super
have
Bowl.
the,
Right.
they would have the Super Bowl there that later that year in January which was Super Bowl IX, I believe it was, with the Steelers and Vikings. That was the last pro game ever played at Tulane Stadium. They probably had a few high school games there or whatever. And ensuing years before they eventually tore it down. But it was one of the last football games played at Tulane Stadium as we knew it. And they had two distinct eras of the Bayou Classic that I could see just looking at the records. Then you first off, you had the Eddie Robinson era, which lasted forever. Okay,
Yeah.
until like maybe the mid to the early 90s.
Early
Okay,
90s, yeah.
Grambling won the first 12, won 12 of the first 17 Bayou Classic from 1974 to 1990, which was and then you look at the players that came through Grambling during that time. It is like a who's who of future NFL stars, and which was pretty much Grambling's calling card pretty much throughout the whole Eddie Robinson era.
Until the things started going south in the early 90s. Absolutely. And actually throughout the 70s and 80s, there were more NFL players from Grambling than there were from Notre Dame. And I mean, it really was significant. That's one of the reasons they decided to go to New Orleans in the first place. A couple of things about what you said that I think might be interesting to some people. That first game that was played was in 1932. At
Mhm.
that point, Grambling was still a rural junior college. And the only reason they played is because Southern, because it was the big school, would play select home games in other parts of the state because Scotlandville was too hard for a lot of people to get to. And
Okay.
so they would go play a game every year in Shreveport because they knew they could sell out in Shreveport because if you were a black football fan in Louisiana in the 30s, you loved Southern. You followed everything they did. They were great. They weren't the Jaguars yet. They were the Bushmen still, but they were they were the team. So they would go play in Shreveport. In 32, they decide that they're going to go play in Monroe on the other side of the northern part of the state. The only available possible school is this little rural junior college, um, Louisiana Negro Normal. And so they come over to Monroe and play at a baseball field.
Mhm.
They play football on a baseball field. It was the baseball field where the Monroe Monarchs, the only Southern team to ever make the Negro League World Series, had done so earlier that year in 32.
Okay.
And it's because the Monroe Monarchs Negro Leagues team played in the Negro World Series against the Pittsburgh Crawfords, the greatest baseball team that's ever existed, that Southern realized there's money to be made up there because they're sports fans up there. They're selling out stadiums and bringing in the Pittsburgh Crawfords. And so
Right.
they decided to play a game against this little rural school. And of course, they trounced Grambling. They just destroyed them, obviously. I mean, Grambling was a 2 year, not just, they had, the football players had to provide their own equipment at Grambling because they didn't have their own supplies. Meanwhile, Southern had been around for much longer. It was a 4 year institution. It had money from the state. It traveled throughout the South. Southern was the big deal throughout the 30s. Well, the first era of the rivalry actually ends in 47. In 47, 15 years after that game, Grambling wins for the first time. Southern had beat them every year, just destroyed them every year. By 47, they win. Grambling wins, and Southern says, "All right, we're not playing them anymore. We played you because it was an easy victory." And so for about a decade, they stopped playing
Yeah, I
because
noticed that. Not to cut you off, but I noticed that while reading it, while looking this up, that there was a gap in
right,
between like 1947. They didn't play again until like 1959 or something like that.
exactly.
And I was wondering why was that? Like it just seemed like they would just could continue to play every year, but it was the reason why was because Southern just like, you know what? We don't want to deal with y'all anymore. Y'all starting to get pretty good. We thought it's an easy win. So you know what? We just gonna back off. All right.
Exactly. And that was the whole deal because I mean Southern for throughout the 30s and the 40s, Southern was essentially doing Grambling or what would become Grambling a favor by
Okay.
playing them because Grambling was a nobody and Southern was, with the exception possibly of Howard and FAMU, the best football program in the country, best HBCU football in the country throughout the 30s and 40s. They were doing this little school in North Louisiana a favor. When you went up to play there, you weren't making any money. And it was a loss for Southern financially every year, but they did it because they were trying to help out the one other public HBCU in the state, and they were doing this. But once they lost, they're like, well, this isn't worth it anymore because we're not making money. If you're going to ruin our record, we're not going to do it. And so they stopped playing. By the time they start replaying again, you know, um, Grambling has gotten going. Eddie has been there for a while at that point.
That's
They're
right.
getting good. And it Southern knows that no matter what happens, win or lose, this is now a money game. This is not us doing a favor anymore. This is we can both make a lot of money doing this. And so they put them back on the schedule specifically because finally Grambling is worth their time and is actually good enough to compete every year and make both schools a lot of revenue, which they needed. I mean, I, the vast majority of both Southern and Grambling's athletic budget comes out of that one game every year. Everything else loses money. The
Hmm.
way they make everything work is because of the Bayou Classic. It just makes so much money. And so they decide to go back and start playing again. And when they do, they keep doing the home and homes because that was, just kind of the way they'd always done it. But Southern was very frustrated because Southern, even in the years they were bad, could sell out their stadium because
Hmm.
they're in Baton Rouge. I mean, they've got a giant audience, they have a longer history. Grambling could not even sell out their little stadium in Grambling. That's the reason why they would go play in Japan and at Yankee Stadium and all the places they would go. They could sell out Yankee Stadium, but they couldn't put 15,000 people in their stadium in Grambling. Same team,
Wow.
same year. That's why they kept doing all that traveling. Their athletic director was a guy named Collie Nicholson, and he's like, well, listen, maybe we should bring the Southern game every year to a neutral site. And the argument he uses to convince Southern is this will guarantee you the paycheck. That way, I mean, we know you make money when we play you at Scotlandville, but you don't really make a lot of money coming up here. We can guarantee you a much bigger paycheck if we all go to New Orleans. And he had to fight a lot of Grambling people to do that because, of course, New Orleans is much closer to the
The
Southern
Baton
campus
Rouge
than
than
it
it
is
is of the
to the
Grambling.
Grambling campus.
Right.
And just socioeconomically, Southern's fans are better off. They're a little bit higher wealth income than Gramblings. They're urban, whereas all the Grambling people are rural. And so there was a lot of pushback to like take this game to New Orleans because Southern was worried that it might not make money because they made so much during their home games. And Grambling was worried that they wouldn't draw anybody because they're up here in the middle of nowhere, Northeast Louisiana. And so he said, all right, here's what we're going to do. We'll do it for 1 year. I promise you. Let's just go do it at the Sugar Bowl, and I'll prove to you that we will sell it out and we will make money. And if you don't like it after this year, it'll be fine. That year was a Grambling home game. And so, since Grambling had the prerogative, he essentially said, I'm taking it to the Sugar Bowl. It's our home game. We'll take the loss. And that way, if you don't like it, we can go back to Baton Rouge next year for your home game. And that's how they got to the Sugar Bowl. And in 74, they sold it out. There were 75,000 people there. I mean, they broke every state record. I mean, it was crazy. Everybody went. It was a gigantic deal. And immediately Southern said, okay, you win. Let's do it.
I can
And
remember, not to cut you off,
oh yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
I remember my dad, my dad, my uncle, and a couple other people went to the inaugural game at Tulane Stadium. And if I remember correctly, or if I'm misremembering this or whatever, it wasn't it like that day it was raining. It was like really
Oh yeah.
bad weather,
Oh yeah.
and it was rainy, but you still sold it out. And they said that it was like just it was rainy and cold, but people showed out for that game. And they were like, and they were kind of skeptical as fans. Like, man, people ain't gonna come to this. They're just trying it out. I don't think a
Right.
lot of people are gonna show up. Come to find out, 75,000 people showed up at Tulane Stadium, which sat upwards of 75 to 80,000 people. If you remember that place,
Oh
it was
yeah.
old and rickety even then, but still, they sold it out. And I remember my dad telling me how bad a weather game that was.
It was bad, but people stayed. They had celebrities come at halftime. I mean, they had the whole deal. And I mean, there are two other important things about that kind of set that up. The first is by 74, we were already 3 years in on construction of what was going to become the Superdome. So they knew that they weren't going to have to play in weather much longer. If they established themselves
That's
in New
true.
Orleans, they were going to have a venue. And the Superdome had already said, we would love to host you every year because the NFL, I mean, they play 8 home games a year. That's not enough to pay for something that gigantic. They needed to
Right.
find other things. And so they're like, yes, we will take that game if you will come here. And so they knew that the following year, they would never have to play in Tulane Stadium again. They were going to have an indoor stadium that sat just as many people. The other important thing is that 2 years before that, in 1972, the Grambling Southern game got canceled because there were protests on campus. This is at the height of the Black Power movement. They
Yeah.
were both at Grambling and Southern. They were protesting because neither of the schools had created a Black Studies department, because the administrations of HBCUs, especially public HBCUs, have historically been very conservative because they have got to try to make sure they maintain state funding, and the students
Right.
weren't having it. At one protest at Southern, 2 days before the Bayou Classic was scheduled in Baton Rouge in 1972, the cops killed 2 students on
That's right.
campus.
I forgot about that story that because that student union is named after them. Denver
That's right.
Smith and
Yeah.
John. I forgot the names, but
Brown.
The Smith Brown Union. That's right. It was Denver Smith and John
Yep.
Brown, right? And
Exactly.
Yes.
And that happened 2 days before they were supposed to play the Bayou Classic. And the
wow,
students went crazy. I mean, they got super mad, rightly so, obviously. They were chaining themselves to the administration desk and everything else. And so, because 2 students had died, because the rest of the students were still protesting, they actually canceled the game, which was a huge hit to Southern's coffers because that was their biggest moneymaker of the year because they were still playing on campus.
right.
And so that was another one of those things that made them say, all right, let's do an annual classic neutral site thing because that way, even if these kinds of protests continue, we'll know we'll still be able to play. And so when you combine all that stuff together, it created the perfect storm, and you end up getting a neutral site classic game that is still the most watched HBCU football game every year.
That's right. Chuck, you got something?
Now, Tom. Yes, Tom. Like in terms of that, because it just seems like, in retrospect, obviously with it being in existence well over 50 years, that some of these things were a no-brainer. But as you alluded to, obviously
Yeah.
it was not when they were deciding whether or not to do it. But it's perfectly positioned in terms of the Saturday after Thanksgiving, which is perfect. For example, if you wanted to go, I live in DC. Dana, who is an alum as well as myself, lives in Atlanta. It is perfectly suited because usually we can go home for Thanksgiving, spend time with our families, and then even take in the game while we're there, as well as some of the festivities. Was it a conscious effort to do it at that time, or is it just something happenstance where they just happen to catch lightning in a bottle or something?
It was intentional. Well, I shouldn't say that. I mean, at first, it was just that once they restarted the game after that long hiatus, for that decade-long hiatus, when they started it back, by that point, the SWAC had developed enough to where they were organizing. I mean, the SWAC is much younger than like the SIAC or the CIA. I mean, it's a lot younger because it's farther west. But by that time, it was a big deal conference. And the organization of that conference had scheduled the Grambling Southern game at the end of the season every year because it was the big rivalry game. And so it was always the last game on the schedule. So, at least initially, it was specifically because of the scheduling, because Grambling had a home game. They said, we're going to Tulane Stadium, whatever. But pretty soon, once they got to the Superdome and they started adding the job fair and they added the beauty pageant and then eventually they added Battle of the Bands and they added all the other things that they added, it became intentional to make sure that it was not just the last game on the schedule, but that it was on the Thanksgiving weekend so that they could bring in people from all over the country. And the vast majority of Bayou Classics, once we started calling it that, have had fans from all 50 states. And there's a reason for that, because they schedule it to a time when people from all 50 states can get back to New Orleans to go watch that game. So absolutely, it started off as just an accident, but it became very intentional. And that scheduling is the reason why you have all the events associated with it, which you probably couldn't do on a, random weekend in October or something like that, when you're just not going to
Correct.
get that many people. But yes, it was very much intentional. And there have been a couple of times since, I guess, maybe the early 80s when we started doing 1AA playoffs. There have been several times when both Southern and Grambling have bowed out of a spot in the 1AA playoffs uh, because no playoff game is going to make them as much money as the Bayou Classic. And the playoffs start before
That's
the
right.
Bayou Classic is played, and they bow out
That's right.
because they know that A, there's way more eyeballs on that game than there are on the 1AA playoffs. I mean, that is one of the, game day's been there for God's sakes. I mean, game day's not going to a 1AA playoff game, but they go to the Bayou Classic. And because of all the money and because of all the events and everything else, they absolutely willingly give up give up the possibility of national championships so that they can play that game because it's that important culturally.
Whenever you talk about the Southern Grambling rivalry, is the in your personal opinion, and you being a sports fan that you are, of course, it doesn't rank as in the prestige of like the same Ohio State, Michigan, or USC, UCLA,
Right.
or anything like that. It doesn't measure it as far as prestige or longevity of everything. But I would make the argument that it is one of the, as far as like football is concerned, one of the most culturally important football games of the year. Not just for Black Americans, but I think for all Americans, especially with the history and the amount of players that have participated in this game every single year.
Absolutely. I totally agree. Now, I will say, as someone who lives in South Georgia, I and who spends a lot of time with people from FAMU because it's just down the road in Tallahassee. I mean, I get into arguments with them all the time about the Orange Blossom Classic and some of the other games that FAMU has played because they think they're the center of the earth and they don't think that they think that we're too far west to matter as much as like Howard Hampton um, or some of the FAMU rivals or things like that, or even like the Turkey Day in Alabama
Right.
with Alabama State and
And
Alabama
Alabama
and
A&M,
Tuskegee.
yeah.
Well,
Oh
and
yeah,
Tuskegee,
Tuskegee. Yeah.
which has its own weird history because they've got a similar kind of dynamic of and a long history there. But I would argue that the difference and what makes the Louisiana game more important is that unlike Alabama and Florida, we don't have a large collection of smaller public HBCUs. We have
Hmm.
two.
Yeah, that's
I mean,
right.
all of our other HBCUs are private. I mean, Dillard's private, Straight's private. I mean, those are all private schools. And now,
Hmm.
granted, Southern, which was founded in New Orleans, used to play them all the time.
Hmm.
But there is something unique about public football rivalries that opens them up to way more people. And just like LSU doesn't have an in-state rival, the fact that we only have these two schools makes it culturally relevant. And when you add the fact that when you combine the professional athletes that have come out of that game, the Bayou Classic, and compare it to literally any other game, it's there's not a contest. I
Right.
mean, that the number of pro athletes that come out of the Bayou Classic, I do not have the exact number, but I guarantee you it's up there with most of the other big football rivalries. Maybe not Auburn, Alabama, and maybe not Ohio State, Michigan, but pretty much all the others. I mean, I would put it in the top 10 of any college football rivalry as far as the number of professional athletes that came out of it. And that matters because it will be the only one on that list that isn't Division 1A. And the fact that you can have the kinds of pull that those two schools have had. Remember, while they might play a neutral site game at the Bayou Classic every year, both Southern and Grambling spent literally 3 decades playing neutral site games all over the globe.
Right.
Grambling played every year at Yankee Stadium because Eddie Robinson and Steinbrenner were such good friends. Southern did the exact same thing. Southern would go play neutral site games in NFL stadiums and sell them out. Specifically because even though they were a 1AA school, they meant something more. They
Mm.
meant something to people in different parts of the country who never had been to Baton Rouge, Louisiana, much less Scotlandville, who would never be able to get there, but they knew that brand. They knew that logo. Same thing with Grambling. And they would go to those games because it mattered, especially because the Bayou Classic starts as a classic in 74. That is the period right as the Black Power movement is waning, when we are getting to a place that where throughout the South we actually have school desegregation everywhere. There is this kind of period, especially moving into the Jimmy Carter years, of some kind of quasi assumption of quasi racial reconciliation. Everybody wanted to be part of that. Now, a lot of those things were myths, and we obviously didn't have the racial reconciliation that
Right.
we were hoping we were going to have. But it comes at the right time to make that matter to everybody. And whenever Grambling would go play in Japan, they would sell out to a crowd of Japanese people who didn't know anything else except they knew that logo. And whenever they played at Yankee Stadium, that crowd was half white and half black, and all of them lived in New York. And because of that, I mean, as somebody who lives in Washington, D.C., I mean, I'm sure you know that, I mean, Howard Hampton is a huge deal, in that area. But because Howard is kind of the Mecca, and because Hampton has this problematic history, this kind of Booker T. Washington history, and because it's relatively small, and because it's almost out of the South,
Yeah.
it's not quite the same as a deep South rivalry like this that represents what I think the vast majority of people see as the deep South Black population. One urban school, one rural school, one Catholic, one Protestant, one, I mean, one, all these different things. I mean, it just fits perfectly with so many narratives that, I mean, it has a relevance far beyond the boundary of the state. To the point where when I got to Georgia, when I moved to teach at Valdosta State, that was in 2010. That was right as this book, the Bayou Classic book, was just coming out. And every single person I talked to um, knew exactly what I was talking about before they ever read the book. They're like, the Bayou Classic, of course, the Bayou Classic. And that goes for white faculty who didn't watch sports to Black members of the community who followed FAMU and cared more about the Orange Blossom Classic and all of the other ones that came out of kind of the traditional bowl areas of South Florida where they were able to draw more people. The other thing is the vast majority of HBCU classics played on a round robin system. So for the Orange Blossom, for example, FAMU, which was a huge school, a huge draw, still is in a lot of ways, they would use the Orange Bowl every year to play their big neutral site game. But because Miami is 7 hours from Tallahassee.
Right.
They would bring in different teams every year. They would bring in Howard. They would bring in people from farther. Southern played in the Orange Blossom before. Grambling has played in the Orange Blossom. They go do that. And so it's a classic, but it's only a classic for fans of one team, which means
Right.
that it's never going to have the kind of cultural relevance that the Bayou Classic has because it speaks to everybody because it's the same every single year.
And plus
Yes,
two,
and
go ahead, Chuck. Go ahead, Chuck. My bad. Go ahead.
no, I was just gonna reiterate one of Tom's points when he said being in the DC area regarding Howard and Hampton. It's a big deal, but it is minuscule in comparison to
Yeah.
Grambling and Southern because many of the reasons that you listed, but then it's really like here, football is important, but they are more into like NFL, whereas like down south, it's in
Right.
our blood regardless of level, middle school, high school, college. And in a lot of ways, you can say, specifically in Louisiana, it's probably like LSU and Southern at times are bigger than the Saints, actually.
Oh,
Just, you
definitely.
know, just from that standpoint in Louisiana. So, yeah, so it was good. So, but do you, not to cut you off, Dana, did the game, this was the classic, and I know that the um Blossom Classic preceded it, but did the
Mhm.
Bayou Classic have an impact in terms of spurning other classics in an attempt to kind of, in similar fashion to Southern Grambling, try to raise revenue or profile for other
Oh,
HBCUs?
of course. Of course, absolutely. I mean, I should say, first of all, even though that the Orange Blossom did come first, I mean, keep in mind, it didn't come before Southern and Grambling started playing. It just came first before we started calling it the Bayou Classic. I mean, Grambling Southern is still an
Yes.
incredibly old rivalry, and in a couple of years, it will literally be the 100th anniversary. So, I mean, this is something that stretches way back, way before we started calling it that. And I should say that even before we started calling it that, it mattered to everybody already, which is why they ended up giving it a name in the first place, because it already had that relevance. Bayou Classic is just a branding of something that already existed. And so even though the other classics can claim earlier, Turkey Day, whatever else in Alabama, whatever else, the Bayou Classic was a touchstone for all of those places to try to do the same thing, to capitalize. The problem is they couldn't because they didn't have two schools with the legacy that those two schools had. I mean, they didn't have years of success and everything else. And also, I mean, you have to keep in mind that everything worked out perfectly for Grambling and Southern in a way that it just hasn't for everybody else. So they play their first game in 32. It was 5 years before that when college football really started to matter in the South. It was in 27 when Alabama goes out to the Rose Bowl and beats Washington and
Right.
comes back. And on the train back, ever since they get to East Texas, going all the way back to Tuscaloosa, there are thousands of people waiting for them at every train stop saying, thank you for defending the South to the rest of the world. The next year, Georgia goes to Yale, which was the big power, and beats them. And all of a sudden, college football becomes everything. And we didn't get pro football in the South because we didn't have integration until 1966 with the Falcons. And then right after that, we end up getting the Saints as the second team. It just didn't exist. And so college football was everything. It was everything. And what I think you all, I'm sure, have noticed as alums is that the majority of people who wear Grambling and Southern gear and the majority of people who attend that game are not alums.
Right.
They are loyal to those schools. They are loyal to those brands because they represent something for them that is different than a degree. I mean, they're not doing it out of a sense of loyalty to the school that gave them their diploma. They're doing it because the schools mean something to them on a different level.
Right.
And that is something that was created back in the 20s, but that Louisiana has that other places, I think, do not have.
Yeah, and for example, like Notre Dame. Notre Dame has this quote unquote subway alumni. You
Right.
know, you know, for Southern and Grambling, I guess we could call it the canal, the canal alumni or something like that. Because
Yeah.
because you do have, and you do know that, and that's something that I have noticed. I can't really speak for Chuck, but I know for as a fact as someone who grew up in the extreme South Louisiana, like
Right.
10 miles from the Gulf of Mexico, pretty much, that you have a lot of guys, a lot of people that essentially represent Southern University, wear their gear, wear their hats, root for Southern every year, but has never set foot in Scotlandville. And the
Of course
same thing
not.
for Grambling. Same thing for Grambling. So you can consider them the canal alumni, so to speak, because they rep the school just like this Subway alumni for Notre Dame does. They represent the school, but they've never been there. But they know, like you said, they know the brand. They've been fans of Eddie Robinson. They've been fans of Doug Williams and Southern Side. They've been fans of Ace Mumford and
Right.
with Harold Carmichael and Mel Blunt and stuff like that. They know those guys,
They do.
and that's what this and it's one of those rare rivalries where it's almost like sometimes people link their identity to their team because the two
Absolutely.
schools are so different as far as like where they're based out of. Like Southern is the city school,
Right.
Grambling is the country school, and Southern is the Southern school, and Grambling is up north, and there's two different ideologies there, and all of that has some kind of, identifying nature to them that a lot of people just sort of gravitate to.
It's absolutely true. And I think the Notre Dame comparison is a good one. I mean, Notre Dame has fans all over the country because if you are Catholic in America, you identify with Notre Dame.
Yeah.
The same is true with BYU. If you are a Mormon around the country, even if you've never been to Provo, Utah, you root for BYU because that's the Mormon school. Well, when these two schools start becoming super relevant, we're still in a period of segregation. And
Yeah.
so if you are Black anywhere in the country and you see this little bitty school in Louisiana selling out Yankee Stadium, you're saying to yourself, well, wait a second, I'm going to find an identity in that, and I'm going to gravitate towards that. And because they came around at a time when segregation was the norm, the rivalry between Southern and Grambling takes on a kind of BYU Mormon or Notre Dame Catholic kind of vibe for the Black population of the country because almost everybody is following all of this in the Black press. And the Chicago Defender and the New York Amsterdam News and the Pittsburgh Courier and all the major Black presses throughout the country are going to be reporting on what Grambling and Southern are doing. And
Right.
so you can follow them in Pittsburgh because the country's largest Black newspaper happens to be there and they're talking about it every single week in the fall. And so it gives you that identity formation in the same way that a Mormon would have with BYU. And maybe that identity formation is different now, but when they started to matter,
Hmm.
with the racial situation the way it was, that creates a lifetime of fandom that doesn't go away just because conditions change racially. I mean, I remember when I was in the 80s, you guys grew up at the same time. You remember in the 80s, every week on the Cosby Show, Cliff Huxtable would wear Grambling and Southern t-shirts on
That's
that
right.
show. I mean, it was a phenomenon even in the 80s, 20 years after that original touchstone created that devotion. I mean, they're getting repped on national TV on a regular basis, even before the NBC contract and all the money that flowed in from that. They're still, I mean, they're you can see a Grambling shirt or a Southern shirt on the Cosby Show just any random week. I mean, it mattered and it created a kind of consciousness about that game and about those schools that went everywhere because shows like that went everywhere.
Now
And
you
it's
uh,
never gone away.
now you mentioned national television, and I want to bring this up. My
Mm.
freshman year at Southern University was 1991. which was the first year that the Bayou Classic would be shown nationally on NBC. I'll tell you a story, and this is truly this is true. Okay, my first week there, they had signed, I think Southern and Grambling signed a contract or whatever. I think somewhere around that time that they were going to be playing on national television on NBC the Saturday after Thanksgiving every year. And I thought they were lying. I'm like, they are not going to play on NBC. TBS maybe
Right.
a smaller channel or whatever, USA Network when it exists, something like that. But on NBC on a Sunday afternoon, the same network that broadcasts Notre Dame, right? Okay, sure enough, about a month ahead of time, you start seeing the advertisement on on NBC, and coming up Thanksgiving weekend, Southern versus Grambling, the Bayou Classic. Check it out here on NBC. I was floored when I saw that. And I was like, do I go or do I stay and watch the game? Because this was like a new experience. I haven't gone to the Bayou Classic pretty much every year since I was in junior high.
Right.
Okay. And having the chance to watch it on television, and it's not like a public access channel in Louisiana, one of the local stations. It was actually going to be nationally televised, and everybody going to get to see Southern and Graham, get to see Eddie Robinson, get to see the Battle of the Bands, you know,
Big deal.
which was a huge, huge deal, Chuck. And you don't even know that. And talk about that aspect of that rivalry and how all of that came about.
Well, it was actually controversial. I mean, there were some administrators at both schools who worried that if you put it on national TV, people aren't going to want to come because they can just watch it at home, and we're going to actually end up taking a net loss on revenue.
I heard that argument before when it kind of came to baseball in the 1930s, and it
Right.
actually increased
No, no,
attention.
yeah, absolutely. And
It
they
increased
were
it.
wrong. No, they were wrong. And people still came. And not only that, but they make so much money from that NBC contract that even if they lost attendance, they would still be making way more money. But that all comes about largely because in the late 80s, there's a lawsuit to change the way TV, that conferences can sign deals with networks to show games.
Right.
It's the reason that today we can watch all the games, but back when we were kids, we had to just watch whatever they showed us. But
Right.
now we can pick all the games. That is the
Yes.
result of a class action lawsuit that comes around in the late 80s. And so when that class action lawsuit goes through and television stations, networks are allowed to kind of pick up whoever they want, and they don't have to worry about a lot of those regulations that they had had before. Of course, NBC is going to lose out on a lot of the big conferences. Obviously, that's the SEC and the Big Ten go other places. And so they shoot for the two things that they feel like can compensate. One, Notre Dame, the largest school that was outside of any conference. We can just show all their home games. That'll give us some kind of content. But we also need kind of tentpole events that are going to bring in more revenue. And the first thing they thought about was the Bayou Classic.
Hmm.
NBC had worked with Grambling several times for their Yankee Stadium games because they're going to New York quite a bit to play. And so they had a relationship with the head of NBC Sports. And Southern, of course, was a gigantic draw. They didn't do the same kind of they didn't have the same pre-existing relationship with NBC, but everybody knew Southern. And so if they're doing this every year, if they're selling out the Superdome every year, which by the way, the Saints were not doing. I mean, the Saints
No.
never did. Never. Not until way after I left Louisiana did the Saints ever sell. I mean, I remember going to the Saints games when I was a kid, and we had those paper bags over to put over our head because we thought that was cool. I mean, it was. I mean, it was. I mean, the one event that the Superdome could count on to cover the cost was the Bayou Classic. It wasn't any of the Saints games. Never. The Bayou Classic outdrew the Saints every year, always. I do not think that's the way it is now. I do not know the last decade of revenue. But before, for everything that I know about, the period that I know about, the Bayou Classic always outdrew the Saints in revenue. It was the third most important um, financial activity in the city of New Orleans every year, behind Mardi Gras and something else that I'm not thinking of. Maybe Jazz Fest, I'm not sure. But it was the third thing. And so New Orleans was paying extra to Southern and Grambling to make sure they kept doing it. And then NBC says, all right, well, listen, if it's that kind of a draw, this can be one of our tent poles. And they still do it. And they still do it. They still find value in it. There was a couple of years ago when NBC was renegotiating that contract, and it looked for at least a little bit possible that that might go off NBC. But eventually, they re-signed. Everything worked, and they were able to re-sign. And it's important that they did. Listen, I am all for ESPN. ESPN stays on in my house literally 24 hours a day. I'm all for TBS and those other stations. But there is something powerful about, and I'm glad that ESPN Plus carries all the HBCU games. I think it's great. I think having access to all those games and to be able to see like CIAA teams that somebody would normally not be able to see is great. I think Johnson C. Smith just made the D2 playoffs, and I think it's awesome. I think it's great. Um, but it's different to be on network TV.
Yeah.
I mean, network TV going out of its way to pay multiple millions of dollars a year to broadcast an HBCU football game that has no relevance to the college football playoff or anything else, but that is just important because of the game itself. I, I, Listen, I can guarantee you that for all the celebrating we do about Auburn, Alabama, and Ohio State, Michigan, I guarantee you that if the games they played weren't relevant to the broader scope of D1 college football, nobody would watch. Nobody
Yeah.
would watch. I mean, think about the oldest college football rivalry is Lafayette and Lehigh in
Yeah.
Pennsylvania. It's a great college football rivalry, but nobody cares because they're not good. And because they're relatively small private schools that are only for a very select group of elite people. The reason we care about these rivalries is because they're relevant. I mean, Harvard Yale is probably the most intense rivalry in all of college football, and yet nobody really cares because we're disconnected from that and because it doesn't actually play into the broader story of college football. Grambling Southern does not play into the broader story of college football. You can watch the entire college football season, love it, follow it all the way to the national championship game, and never have to think about Grambling and Southern because they're 1AA or FCS or whatever they call it now. They're out of that contention and they're not even really qualifying for the playoffs because they're doing their own thing. And yet, they have a multi-million dollar multimedia contract with one of the three big networks in America to show that game every year because they know they're going to hit a rating
Yeah.
while the NFL is playing that weekend.
Yeah.
That is unheard of. And the fact that it's been going on since the early 90s is even more impressive because there have been a lot of lean years for Grambling and Southern since the early 90s. It was in the 80s when a lot of those great black players who would go to play for Eddie Robinson decided to start going to LSU instead. And Grambling and Southern have fallen on hard times in a lot of ways when it comes to athletics. They have been victims of kind of the desegregation of broader college football. It really has hurt them in a lot of ways. And when you combine that with everything else, the idea that they're still on NBC and that they're still making millions every year from that just shows you how important that is. And it's not because of the 85-man rosters that they're fielding this year. It's because of the 85 years before this game this year that have made those two logos so relevant to so many people in so many places that it's going to be broadcast around the world on a network.
Hmm. Well said. I would be remiss if I did not talk about the second part of this rivalry. And it's a rivalry that sparks debate every year. And it's the Battle of the Bands
Right.
between Southern and Grambling. And let me tell you, I have seen instances where people have almost come to blows when it came to arguing who won the Battle of the Bands. You
I
know,
have talked to people in the course of doing research. I have talked to people who go to the Battle of the Bands and do not go to the football game.
I can believe that.
That they are that into that part of it. That they're not even there's one game for them, and it's the Battle of the Bands.
And it's really an interesting part about this rivalry too, is because that you never, when we talk about the other great rivalries around college football, we just talk about the game and then that's it.
Right.
Okay. But in this case, you could win the game, but lose another part of the game, you know, and
And people will be upset.
and
Even
people
the
would be
winners of the
and people
football
would be
game would
sick.
be
People would be
upset.
sick
Yeah,
about it, you know.
it's true.
Just talk about that aspect of it that you discovered while writing this book.
It's a real deal. It's a real thing. Early on in the history of HBCU athletics, they never had athletic budgets. And so everybody had to provide their own things. They didn't have a band because they couldn't afford instruments, because they were getting meager funding from white state legislators that only were creating these schools specifically so that people wouldn't try to apply to places like LSU.
Mhm.
And so they're creating them to kind of maintain segregation. They don't want to give them any extracurricular things. And so bands at HBCUs are one of the most democratic institutions in America. They were created by students and by faculty who brought their own instruments because they were not being funded. Bands were not created at HBCUs by some fiat like they are at most places. At HBCUs, they are the representatives of democracy because the faculty and the students bring their own instruments. They go out at halftime of these football games in the early days, and it was called a rabble, where because we didn't have an organized band, halftime entertainment was people coming down from the stands with their own instruments and playing in a makeshift band that they are just coming onto the field to do at halftime.
Hmm.
And from that is where we get the tradition of HBCU bands. Once they do get funding, of course, HBCU bands are going to be far more show band than most other places because they're coming from a democratic place. They're coming from out of the stands. They're coming from the people in a way that most marching bands are not. Most marching bands are John Philip Sousa, top down. We're going to supply this. It's part of the musical education system of the school. That was never the way it was at HBCUs. They always came out of the crowd. They were from the bottom up. And so the bands mattered in a way that in other places, they're just kind of the musical background noise. In HBCUs, it's different because it is part of the story of the democracy that is created by those institutions themselves. So winning the Battle of the Bands is important because that is a representative of the people. That
Right.
is, and you know, most of us are never going to be able to run the 100-yard dash very fast enough to make the football team. But everybody can learn how to play an instrument. Everybody can find something identity in that. And especially if you know the history of bands at HBCUs, it becomes all the more important. And the Battle of the Bands here is no exception. I mean, certainly every band thinks they're the best band on earth. That is always the way it is. The Marching 100 at FAMU. I know one of my friends who's on faculty at FAMU always tells me about the Marching 100 at FAMU. And I'm like, you don't know anything. You need to go to New Orleans one Thanksgiving and I'll show you. I'll show you what bands really are. But again, it's also a creature of money. So Southern is just a much bigger school, and their band is always bigger, which allows them what as a North Louisianan, I would say, is an unfair advantage because they have a larger band, which means they can be louder.
Yeah.
But but no, I mean it's absolutely important, and it's important for a good reason. I mean, it is the ethos of not just that game, it is the ethos of what it means to be a public HBCU in America. That
Mm.
is what bands are. Most people aren't getting on the football field, but everybody was walking down at halftime to play instruments. That is how we created that in the first place.
Wow. Chuck,
Music
you
was
have anything?
democracy.
Well, I wonder what Tom just mentioned in terms of the unfair advantage. Well, I would have to disagree. I understand your premise, but I would have to disagree respectfully, slightly, because especially in the early years of the '90s, in the Battle of the Bands, at least the
That's
halftime
true.
show portion of it, Grambling would always bring a recording artist to help them out.
That's
Like
true.
That's
they
That
had
is
true.
so
They
Shaggy
true.
would
one
do
year.
That's
that.
true. They
They,
did
they had
that.
they had Mary J. Blige one year. They had Drew Hill another year. Whereas Southern used to go out there as is, and then they would try to. And on the basis of that, my cousins who are all Grambling alums, they were always trying to say, "Well, we beat you guys and all of that." It's like, okay, you went and got Michael Jordan, and we still beat you. You
That's
know,
right.
so you know,
It
so,
doesn't count if you have to bring in a ringer. That's true.
No, it don't. It
correct. You
don't.
know, so
But that's another thing, a lot of the Grambling people, they would always say, as somebody who's from that part of the state, they would always, I mean, they took pride in the fact that they were an open enrollment school. So there is no entrance requirement for Grambling, whereas there is for Southern. Southern always thought of itself as the much better school because anybody could go to Grambling. And Grambling had kind of always argued that, well, we don't have entrance requirements, but that's because we're more democratic than you, because we give everybody a chance. And so, I mean, even when it comes to stuff like that and the relationship of how you see kind of what the university is there to be, it's a totally different mindset, which just makes it all the better when it comes to a rivalry. It's great. The whole thing is amazing. It's amazing.
Yeah, before I get you out of here on this, I just want to just ask you, just if you could, talk about the one aspect of this rivalry while you were doing your research that really caught you off guard or just you were just surprised to hear about.
Well, there are a few, I guess. I mean, the first one is that 1932 game. When I started doing this research, all of the record books at Southern and all of the record books at Grambling said that this rivalry started in 1933. And so my discovery in that book of the actual first Bayou Classic game, which happened a year earlier in neutral site in Monroe, the first neutral site Grambling Southern game happens in 32. That was a big deal for me and for the book, just because I was able to kind of say, well, wait a second, this is actually older than everybody thinks, even the two schools themselves. That was a big deal. The 72 cancellation was a huge deal for me, as you might imagine.
Right.
Um, just incredible the way that worked out. Um, we've already hit these high notes, but the 10-year hiatus because of bitterness over a defeat,
Yeah.
beautiful. I mean, as a person who loves rivalries and sports hate in general, that is solid gold right there. We're just not going to play you anymore. That was beautiful. Um, let's see what else. I guess maybe I guess maybe the other thing is the way the two schools came together to make the Bayou Classic week what they called a happening.
Mhm.
Because while all that stuff is great, they make a lot of money off that football game, and they make a lot of money off the Battle of the Bands the night before. Neither Grambling nor Southern make any money off the job fair. They do that to help people find work.
Mm.
And they say, all right, we're going to have tens of thousands of people here. Let's figure out ways that we can actually make this into something that matters for a lot of other people too. And I think it's the kind of thing that you wouldn't find at Iron Bowl or at the game or at Michigan, Ohio State, that they take a hit. They spend resources that they are making from NBC or from tickets and everything else to go and do things in the community. I mean, after Katrina, I mean, Grambling and Southern, I mean, they spent so much money and man hours in New Orleans helping that community because they knew that community had helped them back in the 70s and
Yeah.
they showed up. I mean, they both showed up. And so I think the fact that nobody sees this as just a football game or just a sports rivalry. I mean, I know this is a sports deal, but this is bigger than sports. I mean, most places aren't going to say, well, hey, we're going to have this game, we're going to make some money off of it. Why don't we try to go find tens of thousands of people jobs every year? That is not something that schools normally think about. And yet they
No.
got together to do that, and they still do it. I mean, some of the more antiquated things like the beauty pageants and things like that kind of come and go, but like job fairs and the food
Yeah.
drive and the other things that they do to help poor people and to try to find people jobs wouldn't happen without that football game drawing the kind of eyeballs that it does. And B, wouldn't happen without two schools that actually understood the history of what it means to be poor in Louisiana, what it means to understand the history of being Black in Louisiana, and that actually put their money where their mouth is while they're making money of their own, to be sure, but who actually spend the time and the resources to parlay their success into success for other people in the state. It's what you would hope schools would do, but most don't. Grambling and Southern do, and they do it specifically because of the platform that that game gives them.
All right. Now, before I let you go, Chuck, did you have anything else before we close up shop here? At least on this sec?
No, I don't. No, I don't have anything else. Just want to thank Tom for his time and just a wealth of knowledge, which is greatly appreciated by not only ourselves but also the listeners as well.
Oh, absolutely. Tom, you have a wealth of knowledge and you enlightened me on a lot of things that I didn't even know about when it came down to this rivalry. I thought I knew something, but
Yes.
obviously I did not know a
No,
number of
there's
things that you brought up tonight. Before I let you go, you have another project that you're working on, and we talked before the before we came on that we were going to invite you back to talk about this upcoming project that you have. Talk about that one and for the two of us, it is something that we are definitely interested in for a number of different ways. Just talk about that for a sec.
Yeah, another race and sports in the South convergence happens in 1970. I think most casual fans of boxing tend to see the timeline of Muhammad Ali, the greatest of all time, as running from his heavyweight championship against Sonny Liston up to when his title was stripped from him for refusing his draft induction into the Vietnam War. And then after 3 years, he comes back and he fights the mega fight with Joe Frazier. And while he loses that fight, he barely loses on points. He gets his rematch, he gets his title back, and he goes on to become the legendary Muhammad Ali. But it turns out, though, that that big fight against Joe Frazier was not the first fight that he had when he came back. He tried in 82 different cities around the country to get licensed. And most of them were in the places that you would see as more racially progressive, certainly more liberal when it came to the Vietnam conflict, but not Las Vegas, not New York, not any of those places would give him the time of day. The one place that he was able to find a venue to fight was, of all places, segregationist Atlanta, Georgia, home of Governor Lester Maddox himself. And the wealthy Black population of Atlanta was incredibly powerful, wielded a lot of political influence, and were able to bring Muhammad Ali back from suspension after 3 years, put him in his first fight against a great white hope, no less, in the Deep South. It was only the first time in the 20th century that a Black man in the South beat the shit out of a white man in the South in front of a large crowd of people and didn't have to worry about being lynched or being thrown in jail or anything else. And that story is the story of a new book that I have coming out on December the 1st called Return of the King. And it is about Muhammad Ali's suspension. It is about race in the South and in Atlanta and how that affects sports. And it's about the history of boxing, both before and after that seminal event. So if you're into it, I'd encourage you all to check it out. It's called Return of the King.
See, that is a subject matter that me and both Charles and I would just be totally involved in, because you think about it, I live in Atlanta. Charles is a big boxing fan, and that fight, from what I remember, was brought about by a local black politician who was really championing this fight for not only for Muhammad Ali, but for the image of Atlanta at the time.
Leroy Johnson was his name. Leroy Johnson had been elected to the state Senate in 1962. He was the first black senator, state senator elected in the South since the end of Reconstruction. He was the most important black politician in Georgia and really in the South. He was the kingmaker. The reason he was able to get that fight is because he's the guy who got all the votes to get the mayor elected. And so this book also tells the story of Leroy Johnson and the rise of black politics in Atlanta. The vice mayor, the mayor is a guy named Sam Massel, who he ends up allowing this fight to happen. The vice mayor is a guy named Maynard Jackson,
Yep.
who supports the fight, sits on the front row. After this is over, he runs for mayor himself, gets elected as the first black mayor of a major city in the South. And it has not been since Muhammad Ali stepped out of the ring in Atlanta that Atlanta has had anything except for a black mayor.
Yep.
We never went back. We never had one before. We've never had a white one since. That's not all because of Muhammad Ali, but it is partly so. And it is partly because of that fight and the racial politics of Atlanta and the South and their intersection with how we think about sports and how we think about electing people to office and all that stuff all comes up. So hopefully everybody will find it interesting.
Chuck, do you have anything else?
Yes, Tom. In terms of the upcoming book release, where can we find it? Because I certainly would be interested in obtaining a copy, as well as I'm sure some of our listeners as well.
Yeah, absolutely. You can anywhere you find your books, you can find it. If you need a convenient place, you can just go to thomasaiellobooks.com and there's a link on there to, I guess, maybe either the press's website or the Amazon site or something. I don't know. But any place you get books should have it. But it's called Return of the King. I have a weird last name, but if you type in, I should say, if you just type in Return of the King, you're just going to get hobbits and stuff. I mean, there's another famous book called Return of the King that has a lot of other stuff in it. But if you type in Return of the King and Muhammad Ali or my last name, you will find it anywhere that you typically find your books.
I will definitely include that into our show notes before, once this episode is released, it will be in the show notes for this book and the History of the Bayou Classic book if anybody's interested in checking that out.
Yeah.
Tom, definitely thank you for joining us. This has been an education for me, and I can't speak for Chuck, but for me, it has definitely been an education for me. And you are welcome back at any time to talk more about your book. And in fact, we are going to have you back on to talk about this book that you just outlined for us at a later date. Yeah, but once again, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Tom. It was just so knowledgeable and just all kind of nuances that we just had no idea about, and just learned a lot from you today. And thanks so much for sharing your knowledge with us. Thank you.
Well, I appreciate you guys having me. Thank you so much.
And we're back, and you're listening to the Historically Speaking Sports Podcast, the podcast that gives you the best of sports from back in the day. I am your host, Dana Augusta, along with Charles Combs. And listen, we'd like to once again thank Tom Aiello for coming on and joining us as we talked about the history of the Bayou Classic and to talk more about the history of that Classic. What really makes the Classic is the players that played in this game. A lot of them have gone on to life outside of football, but a lot of guys went on to have very distinguished careers in the NFL. Actually, some of them Hall of Fame careers. And we're going to talk about a few of those guys at this segment that we like to call the shout out. So first off, let's talk about some of these guys from Grambling. And when we talk about Grambling, first and foremost, you think about Coach Eddie Robinson and the influence that he's had in the sport of football, not only in college, but also pro football. As a little known fact that I learned not too long at the time of his death, that he was actually one of the finalists for the Los Angeles Rams job when Chuck Knox took over the team in 1973, as they fired Tommy Prothro and was in the process of hiring Chuck Knox. But one of the names that was on the short list for Cal Rosenblum, the owner of the Rams at the time, was Eddie Robinson, because of his relationship with players, a lot of the players that was in the NFL at the time, and his name and all of the success that he had at Grambling. But he decided he couldn't leave Grambling. He just couldn't leave it for the bright lights of L.A., and he decided to stay at Grambling for like another 30 years.
Wow, just amazing and just tremendous foresight because, he was definitely more than qualified for the job, but for him to have it in his heart to continue to nurture and develop and cultivate what he had built, it's just an amazing testament of not only him as a coach, but him as a man too.
Okay. Now, when you're talking about football players from Grambling, you got to go all the way back in the beginning. Tank Younger played for the Los Angeles Rams as a two-way player, linebacker, and running back for the Rams during the 1950s. During the heyday of the LA Express type of offense was run by Norm Van Brocklin and Bob Waterfield. He was in the backfield as a fullback. Then here's some other names. Willie Brown, Hall of Famer. Buck Buchanan, Hall of Famer. Willie Davis of the Packers, Hall of Famer. And my personal favorite, former Charger, Charlie Joyner, Hall of Famer.
Just all great players, man. Just Willie Brown, you still remember that iconic image of the close-up of him returning the touchdown, the pick six against the Vikings in the Super Bowl, and then Charlie Joyner, just the ageless wonder. Just
Yep.
with the Chargers all those years, he could give you a lot of good possession and move the chains on third down, but give you some explosive plays over the top as well. With Dan Fowles, Wes Chandler, and that Don Coryell system. And Willie Davis, he was a great player as well. And then it's one of my favorites, somebody that you didn't include on here. I think he spent some time in NFL as well, but the big cat Ernie Ladd.
Yes, sir.
You know,
Yes, sir.
you remember, he wound up, WWE Hall of Famer. He used to wreak all kind of havoc in Georgia and Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling, as well as he and Junkyard Dog and he and Hacksaw Butch Reed used to have some knockdown, drag out fights like the ghetto street fight in Mid-South Wrestling. You remember that?
Yes, sir.
So the great Ernie Ladd too. So yes, sir.
Another, he also played for the Chargers. Another Charger that came from Grambling was Gary Big Hands Johnson, was part of the famed Chargers quote unquote power line during the early 80s with him, Louis Kelcher, Leroy Jones, and Hall of Famer Fred Dean. That was that great defensive line that they had, in which one season they led the NFL as a group, led the NFL in sacks. Then you had other great players from Grambling. James Shaq Harris, the first black quarterback in the AF in to be the day one starter for a team, the season opening starter for the Buffalo Bills in 1968, and he went on to lead the LA Rams to the NFC Championship game in 74 or 75, during the mid 70s with the Rams.
Mhm.
Essex Johnson, running back for the Bengals in the 70s. He was a really, really good player, but injuries slowed him down. Frank Lewis, wide receiver for the Steelers and the Bills, which incidentally, I actually know him personally. He lived
Wow.
in the same city as my wife did. She lives in Homa, and in fact, he's from Homa, and his his family and my wife's family all know each other and stuff like that. And I got a chance to know him and actually worked in a business with him for a short time. Um, let's see, Jake Reed, former Vikings receiver who lined up on the other side of Randy Moss. He was on that team. Everson Walls from Grambling. A lot of great years with the Cowboys, and then later with the New York Giants. Won a Super Bowl with the New York Giants. You know, you talked about Ernie Ladd, and Grambling has had a wealth of players to come through under the tutelage of the great Eddie Robinson.
Yes, a lot of good players, a lot of productive players. And as you mentioned just a moment ago, under the tutelage of Eddie Robinson, but also more importantly, as similar to what I mentioned about Eddie Robinson as well, just good, upstanding men, good,
That's right.
upstanding examples as professional players and as not only men in general, but in specific, good black men, positive role models, pro, positive role models, positive examples, and things like that, and just under that tutelage of Eddie Robinson, and just kudos to all of those guys coming from a Southern alum.
Yep. Now, moving on to our school, Southern University, we've had our share of great players, and
Mhm.
we've had our share of great players and Hall of Famers on our lot. Now, it may not be as many as Grambling. I give them that. It may not be as many, but when it comes down to outstanding players and Hall of Famers, we have our share. We have our fair share. Hall of Famers, Mel Blount, part of that steel curtain defense of the 1970s. You know, one of the few players in those days that walked around with a bald head that both of us could really appreciate. Um, from Baton Rouge, from your hometown of Baton Rouge, you know. Then you had Aeneas
Yeah,
Williams. Then you had Aeneas Williams, who left Southern maybe the same year I arrived at Southern. He graduated from Southern. He left Southern to go to. He was in the draft of the then Phoenix Cardinals in 1991, and had a Hall of Fame career. You know, one of the great defensive backs doing the last 30 years in the National Football League, and also the Linky One himself, Mr. 6'9" himself, Mr. Harold Carmichael. And I heard stories about this man from my dad and my godfather and my uncle that he could single-handedly beat a team by himself because you had never seen a wide receiver at what, 6'8"? You know, I think Harold Carmichael was maybe
yes,
like 6'8", 6'9", and he was a wide receiver. You know, that's tall now, some 40 years after he played, 40, 50 years after he played, he's still one of the tallest wide receivers to have ever played the game. And you just see that number 17 with the Philadelphia Eagles just running people over and just outreaching everybody for touchdown catches from Jaworski.
yes, sir. Just would high point that ball, with jump Ron Jaworski, and then made Super Bowl 15 against the Raiders with old who was it, Dick Vermeil, one of my favorite coaches. Cry too much, but one of my favorite coaches and all of that, man. So he was a very good receiver. Then speaking of Aeneas Williams, man, you have got to be a baller if you making a Hall of Fame. Period is an outstanding achievement in itself. But then when you factor in the fact that he did it while playing for the Cardinals, man.
Yes.
He put in work, and then his career also overlapped Deion Sanders and Dal Green as well. So
Yes.
he was one of the best corners of that era when he was those guys were around. So testament to him. And then last but not least, my brother Mel Blunt, he's one of the three, probably Mr. the original Mr. Bump and Run himself.
Yeah.
Probably the best I've ever seen. He one of the best three I've seen in bump and run coverage, with the other two being the criminally underrated Michael Haynes and
Yeah.
and Lester Hayes. How is not to change the subject? How is Rondé Barber in the Hall of Fame and he can't cover man to man and Lester Hayes is it? That's beyond me, but whatever. Shout out to Mel Blunt.
It maybe has something to do with the stickum. I don't know. Other other people that other great players that came from Southern. Al Beauchamp, linebacker with the Bengals through the late 60s and early in mid 70s. One of a solid defensive player for the Bengals during the Paul Brown era in Cincinnati. A little known running back from the Kansas City Chiefs, but you see him all the time on NFL highlight films, and that's Robert Tank Holmes from the Kansas City Chiefs in the 1960s and early 70s. He's this big, huge, burly running back, wore number 45, who would just run over people constantly. He was that really hardcore power running back, and joining him on those great Kansas City Chiefs teams in the 1960s that won Super Bowl IV with wide receiver Frank Pitts, also a Southern University alum. Moving into the 70s, you had linebacker Isaiah Robertson for the Los Angeles Rams. And unfortunately, his biggest claim to fame was that time that Earl Campbell ran that ball and he stuck Earl Campbell's helmet right in the chest of somebody that you see all the time on NFL films. Unfortunately, that was Isaiah Robertson. But he had a long career with the Los Angeles Rams, and was just an outstanding player for those Rams teams that just could not seem to get over the hump to get to the Super Bowl until the late 1970s and until like January of 80 when they played in the Super Bowl 14. Another one, defensive lineman from the Denver Broncos, and I tell you what, this guy has the coolest nickname I have ever heard for a football player, Rich Tombstone Jackson for the Denver Broncos.
Woo!
And that guy had the greatest Fu Manchu mustache I have ever seen. If you don't know what I'm talking about, Google Rich Tombstone Jackson and check out that Fu Manchu. It is something to behold when you come down to him. But he was an awesome, and you talk about a beast at inside along the defensive line for those really bad Denver Bronco teams of the 60s and early 70s. But he was the one that people always ran away from.
Orange Crush, boy, that I googled it just now. That thing wrap around pretty good, So, that mustache, and yeah. So you mentioned a lot of great players, man, and I know you talk about the '70s. Then you move to the '80s. I know what you're getting to, but I just got to send a special shout out to my man Rufus Porter, boy. He a lot of good years with Seattle Seahawks and all of that. He was a dog. He was in the days of the Marino Chasm days when
Yes.
they didn't have a whole lot to write home about. He was one of the few bright spots. I still remember him most notably. His sack celebration used to be the old hacksaw Jim Duggan. I'm not talking about whole WWE. I'm talking about South Wrestling, hacksaw Jim Duggan, the Stomp, and all that. Him that he used to do it. And so this name here, you may not remember this one, Mad Dog Buzz Sawyer, boy.
Yes, sir. I remember. I remember. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
So yeah, Rufus Porter. So yeah.
A couple others. Maurice Hurst played for the Patriots. Was a defensive back for the Patriots in the late '80s, early '90s. Just Southern University has just been such of a just both teams really, were just so rich of football talent and football excellence over the years. And no wonder this rivalry is just so great. And I would be remiss also, and Chuck, we could talk about this for a quick second before we shut it down. Earlier today,
Of course.
we found out the unfortunate passing of one of my personal heroes growing up, Kenny Easley, who passed away at Hall of Fame defensive back for the Seattle Seahawks in the 80s. And he was just one of those really great defensive backs that played his whole career for one team and was excellent, excellent, excellent. Yeah, I believe he's also in the College Football Hall of Fame as well. As with his career at UCLA, but Kenny Easley, one of the great defensive backs that the NFL has seen in the last 50 years.
Yes, sir. Tremendous safety. He could come up and stick in the run game. Then he also, this is the not running, not like now, where you run across the middle at your own peril, at your own risk. We're not throwing flags today. He used to stick people. I remember him on those great Seattle teams in the 80s. Well, very good Seattle teams in the 80s. Led by, ironically, you mentioned him earlier, old ground Chuck Knox. Old ground Chuck, they used to have Kenny Easley, and then, they had first they had Jim Zorn, and then they turned the reins over to
Dave
Craig, and then you had the great Kurt Warner, the running back, this was before.
This is Kurt Warner. This is
the
C-U-R-T Warner.
Yeah.
Not the K-U-R-T, the C-U-R-T
Yeah.
Warner from Penn State.
Great. Would have probably been a Hall of Fame if not for his knee injury. And then you got the goal that also played alongside with the incomparable Steve Largent. He's
Yes,
run the middle, and get knocked around, and didn't even have any receiving gloves, bare hands.
Yes, sir.
And the great Steve Largent. So yes, he's a part of that great team, and he'll be shocking death, and he'll be sorely missed, but always will be immortal due to his contributions on the football field.
That's it. Well, folks, that will pretty much do it for this edition of the podcast. So stay tuned for us as we close it out right here on this Historically Speaking Sports podcast, right here on the Sports History Network. And that will do it for this edition of the Historically Speaking Sports podcast. Thank you once again for joining us. This podcast comes to you from the Bill King Memorial Studio in the sports wing of TM4 Enterprises, located in suburban Atlanta in the shadow of Stone Mountain. Once again, don't forget to subscribe to the show and to get new episodes whenever they come out. And please, as always, tell your friends, tell your family, tell your coworkers, tell your neighbor, hell, tell a passerby on the street if you think that they like sports history. And once again, thank you everyone out there for joining us. And until next time, we'll see you later.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com. You did not see their faces on the Wheaties boxes, nor did they have the headlines, but they were breaking barriers, one pitch at a time. The integration of minor league baseball, a history and player register, 1946 to 1959, by Rick Swain and Gary C. Fink, shines a light on the overlooked heroes who paved the way for future legends. From dusty bus rides to hostile crowds, these players fought for a place in a game that did not want to see them win. More than history, it's a tribute to courage, perseverance, and the power of a game to change. Honor their legacy today and grab a copy of The Integration of Minor League Baseball at your favorite bookseller.